Saladin, whose armies now surround the Crusaders. For the moment, there is a tense peace between them, but it is one that will not last. Now, the most obvious thing about Kingdom of Heaven is its portrayal of Christian Europe. The opening text of the movie establishes that Europe is in a state of repression and poverty, painting a picture of how bleak and sufferable day-to-day life is for the common man. This is especially true with the colour grading chosen for the opening scenes, or more appropriately, the absence of colour we see. Instead, we get dull greys and cold blues, and this is all done to give the impression that Christian Europe is a dark, backward place, whilst the Muslim world is awash with bright and vibrant colours, and the markets are jostling with trade and commerce, obviously highlighting that the Muslim world is progressive and culturally advanced. This may have been an accurate representation of Europe prior to the First Crusade, but in 1184, which is the film's time period, this is completely ridiculous. Kingdom of Heaven completely ignores that Europe is going through the 12th century Renaissance. Things were actually on the up and up, and the standards of living, both culturally and economically, were, at the very least, equal to the Muslim world. Europeans in their homeland were no more repressed or poverty-stricken than Muslims were in theirs. There was a revival in classical literature and academic studying of philosophy, science, mathematics, and medicine, and a big reason for all of this was due to the Crusades. For the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe was connected once again to the Orient, where it was also flourishing under the golden age of Islam. The Muslims had rediscovered the ancient knowledge that the Greeks had left behind, and through great ingenuity, made huge cultural and scientific advances of their own in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Islam's answer to the Alexandria Library. So the Europeans who went on their pilgrimages to the Holy Land also took this knowledge back home, and the increased trade and commerce between the Muslims and the Byzantine Empire encouraged this cultural exchange of information in Western Europe and made it readily available to everyone. So it's clear that Kingdom of Heaven has some sort of agenda, but what is it? Well, it seems to me that this film is taking a moral stance, and not only refuses to affiliate any positive benefits that may have occurred because of the Crusades to Western civilization, but wants to brand the Crusades as truly motivated by only one thing. Here is the gist of what the film is trying to tell you.
I've given Jerusalem my whole life. Everything. First I thought we were fighting for God. Then I realized we were fighting for wealth and land. I was ashamed.
Aside from our main protagonists, the Christians are generally demonized to be warmongering barbaric thugs attacking defenseless Muslims, and their measure of cruelty is fueled even more so by their religious fanaticism.
There must be war. God wills it! God wills it! God wills it!
In contrast, the Muslims seem to be really reasonable, especially in this scene after Saladin's sister was just murdered by the Christians.
The Sultan demands the return of his sister's body, the heads of those responsible, and the surrender of Jerusalem.
Does he? What answer do you return to Salah ad-Din?
This?
Noticing a pattern here yet? Let me sum it up for you. The film is trying to tell us that the Crusades were primarily an excuse to conquer and subjugate a peaceful Islamic civilization out of a lust for greed and power. What if I was to tell you that the Crusades can be seen as a legitimate response? You probably think I wasn't being very PC, but hear me out. Prior to the First Crusade, the Muslims had conquered and converted nearly 2/3 of the Christian world. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, and a big chunk of Spain and Portugal were all originally Christian lands. That's not even mentioning their invasion of France in 719 and sacking Rome, the capital of the Christian world, in 846. Far from being peaceful, Islamic civilization was extremely warlike and had full intentions to wipe out Christian civilization. The newly conquered Eastern Christians suffered terrible atrocities and oppression by their new Muslim rulers. Christian pilgrims were routinely slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks during their raids against the Byzantine Empire. So, I'm actually surprised that it took 400 years of Muslim aggression before the Crusades finally kicked off. However, I am not condoning what the Christians did either. There are many accounts during the First Crusade of Christians committing horrific atrocities on a massive scale and slaughtering Muslims in their tens of thousands. When the Crusaders finally took back Jerusalem, they slaughtered every Muslim they could find within the city walls. So my point is that this movie should not demonize one group and victimize another, especially since both groups were just as fucking brutal as each other. The character of Balian is so heavily fictionalized that he's almost unrecognizable from the historical figure he's based on. But funnily enough, that's not what bothers me the most in Kingdom of Heaven. It's rather simply this classic case of bad writing where the plot dictates the character rather than the character driving the plot. From a storytelling standpoint, there are just too many things that happen to Balian that doesn't make sense. And the film also seems to be tragically and laughably unaware of the basic medieval environment that contradicts Balian's story arc. Now, I'm guessing that Balian's origin was written to be a fish out of water story in order to introduce the audience to the world of the Crusades. He would be free to ask and have questions answered for him that audiences need to know.
What know you of Saladin?
That he is king of the Saracens, and that he surrounds this kingdom.
He has 200,000 men in Damascus alone. He could win a war if he goes to war, and he's daily given cause for war by fanatics newly from Europe, by Templar bastards like Renard de Chatillon.
You see, if he already knew this stuff and spent his whole life in Jerusalem like the real Balian of Ibelin, then they wouldn't be having this conversation. From a narrative perspective, this makes sense and usually works in other movies, but Kingdom of Heaven's historical setting and events run counter to Balian's journey as a character, and much of it stems from the simple fact that Balian is a blacksmith and above all, a bastard. The moment that Kingdom of Heaven really starts to fall apart is when Godfrey knights Balian.
Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright, that God may love thee. Speak the truth, always, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless, and do no wrong. That is your oath. And that's so you remember it.
Arise, the knight and Baron of Ibelin.
Okay, you've made him a knight. He's still a bastard and has no claim to your land and titles. Now, it's true that a knight can make another knight, but it would have been impossible for Godfrey to legitimize Balian as his successor. If Godfrey had no other male heirs next in line, then his land and titles would have reverted back to the king, who would then choose someone else in his court to be the inheritor instead. So this idea that with a swish of his sword, Godfrey could make Balian the next Baron of Ibelin is just bollocks. Another thing that is just hard for me to believe is just how accepting everyone is of Balian when he arrives in Jerusalem.
You're your father's son. He was my friend. I'm yours.
I loved your father. and I shall love you.
Keep in mind that this is the first time they've ever met Balian. They have no idea who this man is. Any assumption they might have of him is only based on the fact that he is Godfrey's son, and even Godfrey didn't really know Balian that well, or had anything to do with his upbringing. So I must stress that Balian is, by all accounts, a complete stranger to these people, and yet they welcome him with open arms.
If you continue like this, I shall have to find a use for you. If God can spare you, that is.
God does not know me.
Yes, but I do.
I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but no, you don't. This is only the second time you've ever met the guy. I would strongly recommend that you get to know him a little bit first before deciding on how to use him, or at least have a conversation with him that lasts longer than 5 minutes.
We have decided that you shall take command of the army of Jerusalem.
Really? Don't you want to, I don't know, perhaps look at his resume before making this important decision? Maybe get an idea of his qualifications before risking absolutely everything on him leading your fucking army. In fact, let's do that right now and see if he's fit to be a general. See, okay, there's that one time he trained with Godfrey.
Never use a low guard. You fight well. Let's work on your skills. Take out. A high guard, like this. The Italians call it la posta di falcone, the guard of the hawk. You strike from high, like this. Do it.
Which lasted just over 60 seconds. We don't see him do any other training, so I have to assume that was the extent of it. Still, I guess it came handy when he fought that guy's servant.
Fight me fairly! What him out! Why? Why should he? He is a knight.
And that one other time he led that suicide charge against the Muslim horde and getting most of his men killed in the process. Yes, I know he did it to buy time for the peasants to escape, but still, I wouldn't place this as the highest example of his capability to lead men into battle. So, King Baldwin, since that is the extent of his experience, would you please reconsider another role for Balian?
Would you marry my sister Sibylla were she free of Guy de Lusignan?
Okay, that's it. Fuck this movie. I'm sorry, but if this movie is not going to take itself seriously, then why should I care? This movie clearly doesn't give a shit because these characters aren't acting like real people. Medieval society would never accept a bastard as king. The social stigma in doing so would result in political upheaval and outright civil war. And yet, they expect us to accept this without question. I can't understate how much Balian manages to aggravate me and fascinate me at the same time as a character. Like, 1 minute, he doesn't know what a Muslim is.
Who are those men?
Muslims.
Saracens.
And yet, somehow, despite his previous career as a blacksmith, knows the process of agriculture and successful irrigation in a land and climate he is not familiar with.
Stop! Stop!
And also with no training whatsoever, knows the logistics on defensive siege warfare.
Mark 400.
400! 400!
and has the balls to give strategic advice to a military council on how to fight Saladin, despite the fact that he has never fought a real battle in his life.
No. If you must have war, this army cannot move away from water. You have a chance to hold the city, but if you move out against Saladin, this army will be destroyed, and the city left defenseless.
When I wish a blacksmith to advise me in war, I will tell him.
Hopefully, it's clear by now why it's so hard for me to buy into this bullshit. They can't do a fish out of water story and have the main character have all the skill sets of the historical figure they're based on. You see, the real Balian of Ibelin would be able to do all this shit because he was born in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was also a nobleman by birth and had an extensive military background fighting the Muslims. By making him a blacksmith and bastard, they severed any credibility this film might have had in telling this amazing story. Balian's deeds not only seem improbable, but by this simple change, impossible. You know what the worst thing about Kingdom of Heaven is? It's boring. And it shouldn't be boring because it's centered on one of the most fascinating periods in history. We have a flat, boring protagonist who has to be told what his moral convictions are instead of just discovering them for himself. We also have one-dimensional, cartoonish villains with no real conviction or motivation other than simply just because they're evil.
I am what I am. Someone has to be.
And so we end up with an historical epic with a clairvoyant disregard of its own history, choosing to endow 21st century morals on 12th century characters. The thing is that, when I look at history, I see it as a testament to humanity's greatest triumphs and worst crimes. We cannot celebrate one half and ignore the other, or worse, change details about that half for the sake of appearing politically correct today. These things happened and there is nothing we can do about that. The only responsible thing we can do is to learn from our past mistakes. Otherwise, they will fade into obscurity and pose the risk of us having to repeat them again. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comments section what you thought about Kingdom of Heaven. And of course, what historical film should I review next? Until then, I'll see you next time.
Ah, konnichiwa, History Buffs. Watashi no namae wa Nick Hodges.
Pintuț.
Watashi wa...
Te-ai uitat și tu la History Buffs? Ne-am văzut aproape.
Hotondo no Rasuto Samurai anata ni teiji suru koi de aru.
Okay, in all seriousness, this is a fantastic movie, covering a period in history that I don't think gets as much attention as it should. This is the story about Captain Nathan Algren, a retired American officer who was hired by the Japanese to train their army to quell a samurai rebellion. Over the course of the film, however, he begins to admire the samurai and their cause, eventually switching sides to fight for them. But really, this is a film about the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, and how one way of life that endured for hundreds of years was coming to an end, and how Japan's rebirth into the modern era was about to begin. This is The Last Samurai. By the mid-19th century, whilst the rest of the world was playing the game of empires and changing under the Industrial Revolution, Japan was still a feudal society. This is because when the Tokugawa shogunate seized power in 1603, They cut off all trade with the outside world and had any foreigner who landed on their shores instantly put to death. This policy of self-isolation was put into place for fear that foreign influence would destabilize the country. Until just recently, Japan had been engulfed in a series of bloody civil wars fought by hundreds of feudal lords called daimyo. Serving each daimyo were an elite class of warriors known as the samurai. Like the medieval knights of Europe, they too were bound by a code of ethics similar to chivalry known as bushido. For over a century, the samurai battled each other in a never-ending power struggle for their daimyo in order to claim the ultimate title of shogun, the most powerful of all daimyo, the military dictator and ruler of all Japan. It wasn't until Tokugawa Ieyasu proclaimed himself as shogun did the country finally know peace and was unified as one nation. But there was a genuine fear that outside influence could very well challenge the balance of power. After suppressing a bloody Christian uprising in 1638, the Tokugawa shogunate imposed a self-isolationist policy called sakoku that forbade any foreigner to enter Japan or any Japanese to leave it. So for over 200 years, Japan became an island frozen in time. It was still very much the same feudal society ruled by the shogun and the samurai since the 17th century. But all of this would come crashing down when on July 2nd, 1853, 4 black ships were spotted off the coast, heading directly to Edo Bay. It was an expedition sent by the United States to end Japan's self-isolation, and leading it was Matthew Perry.
What? I didn't even know that. Why didn't you tell me?
No, not that Matthew Perry. Commodore Matthew Perry. His mission was to force Japan to open its ports at all costs, and he landed on Edo Bay presenting the Japanese an ultimatum. Either to open their country up for trade, or the United States would take their country by force. Matthew Perry gave them a year to decide before leaving, promising to return with even more ships. Now, I can't even imagine the shock and panic that gripped Japan. They had never seen such ships before. I mean, it would be like the equivalent of that scene in Independence Day where the alien spaceships float over the White House.
Now what do we do? Address the nation. There's gonna be a lot of frightened people out there. Yeah. I'm one of them.
True to his word, Matthew Perry returned on the 13th of February 1854, this time with 10 ships. The Japanese then had really only 2 options to make. The first was to go for war, which I'm sure there were plenty of samurai leaning in that direction, or accept the humiliating demands, which is of course the smart choice, and that's exactly what they did. In fact, they even took it a step further. As much as they resented the Americans asserting their dominance, their technological advances certainly impressed the Japanese. They knew that in order to survive in this age of Western imperialism, they would have to modernize, and fast. Their speed and efficiency in doing so cannot be understated. Hiring thousands of experts from Europe and North America to advise and teach, Japan was able to achieve nearly 300 years of Western technological advancement in just over 20 years. This included railroads, a modern army and navy, factories and telegraph lines. They even adopted Western clothing, clearly stating that Japan was a modern nation, equal in power and stature to the West.
ご新兵を増強し、学校教育の充実を図ることは急務です。かろうじて列強の侵略を阻んでいるのはアジアでは我が国だけであり。
But in order to do so, they had to completely change their political structure from top to bottom. The samurai were now becoming more and more obsolete by these reforms, and were no longer the top class they had once been. By 1876, when the movie begins, more and more of their privileges were being stripped away as they were now not really needed in this new Japan. Tensions were running high as the samurai believed that the country was changing too fast, and war for the very soul of Japan was about to begin. Now, you would have to be really stubborn not to see the similarities with The Last Samurai and Dances with Wolves. It's practically the same story. An outsider from an aggressive, militarily expansionist civilization mingles with the technologically inferior indigenous population and grows to love them, even fight for them. It'd be easy to stand up and shout rip-off due to themes and the story it's trying to tell, about the last days of a native people. Its great writing, though, goes a long way to get the audience to sympathize and feel a really high stake of jeopardy lurking over our characters. Unlike that one other really overrated movie. So what, they're gonna kill a bunch of Smurfs in this one spot in the jungle? They have a whole planet to contend with! I'm sure there's more of them!
That doesn't make sense.
So anyway, our main protagonist of the film is Captain Nathan Algren, who is an American advisor paid by the Japanese to train its new model army in modern warfare. He's loosely based on French Captain Jules Brunet, who trained and fought with the Shogun in the Boshin War 7 years earlier. But you might as well not need to know that, because in actual fact, Algren's a totally different character by this point, but written in a bit more of a believable way. As much as I love Dances with Wolves, even I have to admit that these types of films tend to follow a certain movie trope, which I like to call the white savior complex. That's basically when a native people face annihilation and a white man comes in to save the day with his awesome power of being white. But we don't get that with The Last Samurai. Nathan Algren is simply witnessing a moment in history, but is unable to shape it. The inevitability of the samurai's demise later in the film is clearest to him because he understands the futility of their situation in facing off against a modern army. This is drawing from his own experiences when he fought against another native people.
The Emperor is most interested in your American Indians, if you have fought against them in battle.
We have, Your Highness. The Red Man is a brutal adversary.
オルグレン隊に聞いてほしい。その民は戦の前、わしの羽で飾り、顔に色を塗るというが、本当か？恐怖心はないのか？
The Emperor wishes to ask Captain Olgren if it is true they wear eagle feathers and paint their faces before going into battle, and that they have no fear.
They're very brave.
It's quite hard not to draw parallels between the Native Americans and the samurai. They're both an ancient people with a deep, rich culture, and unfortunately stood in the way of imperialism and industrialization. This is not lost on Algren as he feels a real sense of déjà vu in his new assignment.
I have been hired to help suppress the rebellion of yet another tribal leader. Apparently, this is the only job for which I am suited. I am beset by the ironies of my life.
What I especially like about this character is that he is a lost soul without a people to call his own, clearly tormented by guilt due to his past. Throughout the movie, we see him on a path of self-destruction, smothering his nightmares with alcohol abuse.
This is a punitive expedition, Captain.
Colonel Bagley, these people had nothing to do with the raids.
Quietly now, boys.
When Algren gets captured by the samurai, the film makes it clear that this is a character who wants to die and sees no chance of redemption for the crimes he has committed. Due to his imprisonment, however, he is denied his usual supply of steady booze and he regresses in a state of detox, unable to ignore the screams of the dead. Finally overcoming his alcohol addiction, he is free to walk amongst the samurai, first as an outsider, but gradually over time he begins to respect them and their way of life, finding something in them that had all been but lost to him.
Everyone is polite. Everyone smiles and bows. But beneath their courtesy, I detect a deep reservoir of feeling. They are an intriguing people. From the moment they wake, they devote themselves to the perfection of whatever they pursue. I have never seen such discipline.
These little moments truly are the heart of the film. Bit by bit as the movie slowly progresses, we can really see the journey of Algren's character arc and even understand what it is about the samurai he finds so attractive. The friendships he makes between Katsumoto and the other samurai feel real and heartfelt when he makes that ultimate decision in the end to fight for their cause, even though he knows that there is no chance of them surviving. So it makes sense why Organ would want to switch sides in the first place, and at least he did it for a noble cause, unlike Jake Sully, whose reasons in doing so seemed to be primarily motivated out of his curiosity and interspecies erotica. Whilst Nathan Algren is a completely made-up character, Katsumoto is heavily based on the real samurai rebel leader Saigo Takamori. Like Katsumoto, he also believed that Japan was changing too fast, but he was not completely against modernization. He understood the potential dangers the Western powers could inflict in Japan for not doing so. So Saigo backed up many of the social and political reforms that were going on and helped to overthrow the shogun in the Boshin War, placing Emperor Meiji as the central figurehead in the Japanese government. One of the biggest reforms he supported, actually, was the modernization of the Japanese army. There are actually many pictures that could be found of Saigo Takamori wearing a Western uniform. Unlike his film counterpart Katsumoto, Saigo had no problem whatsoever with using guns, and when he didn't use them, it was not for the stupid reason that the film states.
Who supplies our weapons? 侍の道を知る者たちに崇められておる。今さら飛び道具は使わんだろう。Katsumoto no longer dishonors himself by using firearms, you see.
He uses no firearms.
You see, to those who honor the old ways, Katsumoto is a hero.
He's also an idiot. I'm sorry, but if Katsumoto doesn't see the advantages in using projectile weapons, then he really is an idiot. Historically speaking, the samurai were never stupid enough to scoff at the idea of using guns, well, at least the ones who survived. Dishonorable to use guns. The samurai have been used to shooting each other for 300 years, so what the fuck is he talking about? Because Saigo Takamori had no problem using guns whatsoever. He outfitted his samurai rebels with guns and cannons, only to later fall back on conventional samurai weaponry when he ran out of ammunition. Now, of course, one of the biggest differences between the character of Katsumoto and Saigo were their reasons for rebelling against the imperial government in the first place. For example, with Katsumoto, his cause is highly romanticized in the movie, portrayed to be an actual service to an emperor who is really being manipulated by ambitious men like Amura, blind to what is actually going on, where the samurai are being targeted by the government almost like an ethnic group, to be ostracized and humiliated in public. The banning of the samurai's right to carry their swords was the final straw due to their cultural and spiritual significance. Now, whilst a lot of this is true, the samurai were really just fighting to protect the status of their class and their privileges, such as exemption from taxation, the right to kill a commoner if they were given disrespect, and being the only ones allowed to fight. For hundreds of years, the samurai had been used to being the top dogs in Japanese society, but now they were no longer really needed in this day and age. So it was only in the face of their class's abolition did they rise up. However, not all samurai resisted such change. During the 200 years of self-isolation, Japan had enjoyed a long reign of peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity is wonderful and all for the common man, but it wasn't all that great for the samurai. The warrior class had no wars to fight, and the status of their class forbade them from taking any other form of employment because it was considered beneath them. And I'm sure many resented the fact that, whilst their form of income was fixed, the absolute bottom class, the merchants, started earning more money than them. So these social reforms actually provided many samurai a way out of their class's restrictions, allowing them to work as merchants, government officials, to serve in the armed forces, and etc. So the film's title, The Last Samurai, is a tiny bit misleading, as many of the politicians and officers who fought against the samurai were also samurai.
Well, the general and Katsumoto fought together for the emperor.
He fought with the samurai.
his samurai.
Now, I must stress that as much as I love The Last Samurai, I have to let you know that you cannot take it too seriously within its historical context. For example, one painfully inaccurate scene is the fog battle. Apart from the fact that it probably didn't happen, its portrayal of the capability of the Imperial Army by 1876 is completely ridiculous. The Imperial Army had already been tried and tested during the Boshin War, yet in the movie they are completely inexperienced and can't shoot for shit, giving the impression that this is the first time this modern army has ever fought against the samurai, which just isn't true.
Our men are running from the battlefield! Shameful display!
However, I do understand why it's in the movie. It obviously wants to show how formidable these samurai warriors were, even though Saigo Takamori actually lost every single battle he fought. But the film's main objective is not to present an accurate portrayal of the Satsuma Rebellion, but to give a small insight into samurai society in its last days of glory. Olgrin is not only a great character, but is also a great narrative tool in the story, allowing the audience to see the simple lives of the samurai through his eyes, and the painful transitional period between feudal and imperial Japan. The final moments of the last battle in the film not only is very close to what happened in real life, but is also the perfect metaphor, marking the end of one Japan and the beginning of another. How a class of ancient warriors that ruled Japanese society for hundreds of years was cut down by the industrial age. Years of training and skill with the sword and bow cast aside for the efficiency of mass-produced weapons of war. It's an incredibly powerful scene and truly captures the spirit of the samurai. Choosing to go out on their own terms, rather than fade away from the pages of history, to die with honor, rather than live without purpose. Their sacrifice for what they believed in struck such a chord with Japanese society that Emperor Meiji posthumously pardoned Saigo Takamori, and he became a national hero. The imperial government quickly revived elements of Bushido and adopted it to become Japan's new nationalist moral code. Honor, duty, loyalty to the emperor, and self-sacrifice were all attributes of the samurai that would endure well into the 20th century. Well, that about wraps it up. up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching.
鏡の前に立ち足元にへばりつかせたため息は自ら呼吸する際も意欲もないことを告げていた。野暮な本音は裂け目に任せで任せは見知らぬあなたによしな肉汁に満ちた表情など後ろにとかけを伝ってしまえばいい。そこをするふりをして流れ込む常識のるつぼへ無風にかたどられるナンバー完全に広がる体脂肪のよるべないされと投げ打つことはない。みなかみがうものみなかみがえるどちらかを旅しているようだ。
Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges and I'm here to bring you my first historical film review set during the Second World War. And what better one to start with than Saving Private Ryan? Out of all the possible films I've yet to review, this one has been my most requested, and I completely understand why. It is also one of my favourite World War II movies, and it was about time I took a crack at it anyway. So for those of you who don't know, this is a film set during the Allied invasion of Normandy towards the end of the Second World War, and it's a story about a squad of rangers sent on a dangerous mission to rescue a soldier deep behind enemy lines.
Some private in the 101st lost 3 brothers and he's got a ticket home.
So over the course of this review, I'm going to be discussing the background behind D-Day, and of course, the real historical inspirations behind Saving Private Ryan. June 5th, 1944. Much of Europe is under Nazi occupation. For 4.5 years, the continent has been devastated by severe conflict, and many have seen their country swallowed whole by Hitler's Third Reich. But the cogs in the German war machine are beginning to crack. To the east, the invasion of Russia has been met with disaster, and the German army is on a complete retreat with the Soviets chasing them. The Allies have kicked the Germans and the Italians out of North Africa and have defeated them in Sicily. But the fighting grows fiercer as they make their way through Italy. With the rugged terrain naturally favouring the Axis powers, a second front was needed to take the fight back to Germany. And in order to do that, the Allies must invade the mainland. Standing in their way is Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a series of fortified concrete bunkers with artillery machine gun positions defending nearly 2,000 miles of coastline, stretching all the way from Norway to Spain. Nazi propaganda declared it to be impregnable, and it was up to Eisenhower, the Allied commander, to put that statement to the test. Hitler's ill-fated decision to abandon his original plans of invading Great Britain had come back to haunt him, as the island now hosted an army of 300,000 Allied troops, ready to flood in across the Channel at a moment's notice. By this point, the Germans had figured that northern France would be the most likely point of invasion, but exactly where was the subject of much debate. Hitler himself was convinced, or more appropriately convinced himself, that would happen at the Port de Calais, the shortest crossing route between England and France, which was why he focused his efforts into making it the most defended. And the Allies took great effort not to dissuade him otherwise, and they actually used some pretty ingenious methods. For example, in the southeast of England, they set up an entire fake army encampment. From the air, the Germans would think they were seeing entire tank divisions, when in reality, they were inflatable balloons. Pretty cool, right? In fact, pretty much everything in the encampment was fake. They even had radio operators whose job it was to all day long give fake orders to fake battalions to move to fake locations, and this absolutely worked. The Germans were completely suckered in by this deception. However, the one thing the Allies couldn't control was who amongst the German military leadership was given the task of overseeing the Atlantic Wall. And unfortunately, it was one of their most capable commanders, Erwin Rommel. Before he arrived, the coastal defences were in pretty poor condition, and his experience of fighting the Allies in North Africa gave him valuable insight of what was to come, and he made an effort to visit much of the fortifications in person, ordering thousands of mines, hedgehogs, tank and boat obstacles to be placed on the beaches. In case of an airborne drop, Rommel flooded many of the fields behind the coastline, creating natural swamps, which was extremely dangerous as any paratrooper who landed in these fields would drown. Fortunately, in spite of Rommel's best efforts, the Atlantic Wall was far from being complete. With the Germans having been deceived that the invasion would happen at Calais, Eisenhower turned his attention to Normandy, where the real invasion would take place. It was then that 5 beaches were chosen. The Americans would take the ones codenamed Utah and Omaha, whilst the British and the Canadians would take Gold, Sword, and Juno. In the hours leading up to the attack on the beaches, a massive airborne drop would take place. The paratroopers' objective were to delay any German counterattack before a beachhead was established. And so, after months of planning and numerous deadlines changed due to bad weather, the date was finally set for the 6th of June, 1944, and the liberation of Europe would begin.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Pretty soon after the movie begins, we are taken to the landings of Omaha Beach. Now, this has to be one of the most incredible and horrifying opening sequences ever put on film. And the majority of what you see really did take place, but it's the little details that truly speaks volumes about Saving Private Ryan's great care for authenticity. Like how we see many of the soldiers vomiting as they head to the shore. To the casual viewer who doesn't know much about history, it might appear that it's simply due to nerves. And whilst yes, that is one reason, but the main one is due to seasickness. Many of the soldiers had been fed a heavy meal before they set off, and you can describe the thinking behind it similar to how a con man is served his last supper before his execution. Combine that with the turbulent sea rocking the landing craft up and down rather violently, and you have a lot of sick GIs. Now there's one quick little inaccuracy I have to point out, and to be perfectly honest, I was debating about whether it was even worth mentioning. But if I didn't, I'm sure it would have been brought up in the comment section anyway.
Clear the ramp! 30 seconds!
Okay, that guy right there should not be American. And the reason why is because all of the landing crafts that dropped off the 2nd and 5th Ranger battalions were crewed by British servicemen driving British landing crafts called LCAs. Why am I mentioning this? Because there are some people who use this scene as an example of how the movie insinuates that only Americans fought in the Normandy invasion, as we never see any Brits or Canadians or any other allies fighting alongside them. Personally, I think these comments are unnecessary because I don't see any point in getting worked up over a few seconds worth of footage. So anyway, as the landing craft approaches the beaches, the movie's back on track with being accurate again. The soldiers on board are absolutely terrified as they can hear incoming mortar fire as it gets closer and closer to the shore. All of them getting ready for what they were trained to do, for the ramp to lower and to storm onto the beach to take out the bunkers. With only a few seconds to spare, the soldiers had no choice but to jump over the side into 10 feet of water to escape the hail of machine gun fire. But as soon as they slipped beneath the surf, another problem came up. Their heavy equipment, now completely drenched, weighed them down like an anchor. With many of the soldiers feeling seasick, some had no energy left to swim to the surface and drowned. This is exactly how the first minutes of the beach landings at Omaha went down. And yet within that same sequence, another inaccuracy pops up. It's when we see soldiers being shot and killed underwater, which is impossible considering how deep they are, and the reason why is because it goes against Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted on by an outside force. You see, the moment a bullet hits water, all momentum is lost, and they just sink harmlessly. In real life, the water was actually protecting these soldiers from enemy fire. So, this is just Hollywood breaking the laws of physics for dramatic effect, and it's not the only time Saving Private Ryan does this. Like in the bell tower scene, the character Jackson pulls off an impossible shot when he manages to shoot the German sniper through the scope into his eye. And the reason why it's impossible is due to the distance.
I didn't see it. 450 yards, Captain, maybe shade under.
The problem here is that at 450 yards, gravity will work against the bullet, causing it to drop, meaning that the sniper has to compensate for this by firing above the target. So when the bullet finally reaches its destination, it'll be from a downward angle, and thus will be unable to pass cleanly through the scope. But anyway, I've waffled on too long about this, so let's get back to Omaha. So when Captain Miller is finally able to swim ashore, that is when we see this movie truly excel. Despite all of the technical nitpicking I just went over, despite all of the inaccuracies this film has, Saving Private Ryan visually recreates the horror of war. We see limbs being blown off, we see a man holding onto his exposed entrails calling for his mother. This is not a romanticized depiction of war, but the ugly truth. This is about as close as we're ever gonna get to understanding what these poor men went through, and never for a second do any of us look down on the soldiers that are too terrified to move.
Move up to the seawall! Sir, I'm staying! Clear this beach, make way for the other! This is all we've got between us and the Almighty! Every inch of this beach has been three-sided! You stay here, you're dead now!
Amazingly, despite their natural instinct to find cover and get as low to the ground as possible, with great courage, these men picked themselves up and made their way right up to the seawall. However, they were unable to continue any further, as their path was blocked by rows and rows of barbed wire. With incoming mortar and machine gun fire pinning them down, and the tide steadily creeping in behind them, a solution was desperately needed to get past this obstacle. In preparation for this, the army had provided Bangalore torpedoes, which were tubes packed with explosive charges. Once the men had slipped them beneath the barbed wire, they lit the fuses and waited for the path to be cleared.
Fire in the hole! Fire now! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! We're in business, defilade! Other side of the hole!
With the obstruction ahead obliterated, the soldiers were finally able to charge up the hill. Now, by this point the battle had actually been raging for about a few hours and the Germans were running low on ammunition, and when word started reaching the Navy that some of the men had successfully broken through the German lines, the order was given to provide artillery support. After an intense bombardment, the enemy's will to fight was broken, allowing the Americans to take the beaches, and the Battle of Omaha was over. Now, before I wrap up this part of the review, I would like to point out one scene that really deserves a mention.
What? What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying! What'd he say? What'd he say? Look, I washed for supper.
Okay, there are two reasons why this scene is brilliant. One, it shows that the Allies committed atrocities the same way the Germans did, to show the war not in a clear cut of black and white, but in ugly shades of grey, which is extremely accurate. And secondly, what's even more impressive is that those two German soldiers are not German. This is what they were actually saying.
What? What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying!
Since these soldiers are speaking Czech and claim to be Czech, then most likely they were conscripted into the German army when Czechoslovakia was conquered by Germany in 1939. They would have been part of the Ost battalions, which were military units that conscripted citizens from Eastern European countries as well as from the Soviet Union, and many were forcibly drafted from POW camps. It's a tiny detail, but it's brimming with history, and I absolutely love it. To me, this is real filmmaking here. I mean, not only that, but humble filmmaking, because Steven Spielberg doesn't feel the need to provide subtitles. It's not really required for the scene to have an impact, but when I found out about it, it just made me appreciate this film a whole lot more. So the first 20 or so minutes of Saving Private Ryan is, for the most part, pretty accurate. Whilst yes, I could have gone over a few more technical details, like the fact that we don't exactly get much of an idea of the actual scope of the battle and how long it was fought for, and etc. But the movie's authenticity pays off by showing us what it was actually like for the soldier on the ground, which is an incredible achievement worthy of a historical film. So all of that stuff is accurate, but from this point forward, it's pretty much all fictional. There was no Captain Miller, there was no Private Ryan, or any mission to rescue him from behind enemy lines. The final battle in the film didn't happen either because the town of Rommel never existed. This is just a few of the examples I could give. Now, although none of the plot is true, there are elements of truth to it, if that makes sense. For example, the reason why Private Ryan is recalled from active duty because his 3 brothers were killed in combat is based on a real American military policy. On November 13, 1942, an event occurred that shocked America. In the South Pacific, a fierce naval battle took place during the Guadalcanal campaign. One of the ships involved in the fighting was the USS Juno, and serving on board were the 5 Sullivan brothers. They all enlisted together and wished to serve together on the same ship. But tragically, the Juno was attacked by a Japanese submarine and was hit by 2 torpedoes. When the ship sank, well over 600 sailors were killed, including all 5 of the Sullivan brothers. When the news hit America, there was a public uproar, and to assure families that such an event would never happen again, the military put into effect a policy known as the sole survivor rule. The idea behind it would be to split up brothers serving together so they cannot all be lost in a single battle. And if by circumstance all of the brothers died except for one, then that sole surviving brother would be sent home. And in Saving Private Ryan, that's exactly what happens. Private Ryan loses all of his brothers, and the military has to act on this policy. But the problem presented in the film is that they don't know where Ryan is.
Any contact with the 4th son, James?
No, sir. He was dropped about 15 miles inland near Neuville, but that's still deep behind German lines.
Mac, there is no way you can know where in the hell he was dropped. General, first reports out of Ike's people at Schaeff said the 101st is scattered all to hell and gone. There's misdrops all over Normandy. Now, assuming Private Ryan even survived the jump, he could be anywhere. In fact, he's probably KIA. And frankly, sir, we go sending some sort of rescue mission, flat-hatting throughout swarms of German reinforcements all along our axis of advance. They're going to be KIA too.
And this is the big question asked by the movie. However noble the mission, is one man's life worth risking the lives of others?
You want to explain the math of this to me? I mean, where's the sense of risking the lives of the 8 of us to save one guy?
There is no sense. I'm sorry to say this, but I highly doubt that such a mission like the one presented in the movie would ever be authorized. I mean, due to the manpower and the resources needed for what is essentially a tactically insignificant mission.
It's not going to be easy finding one particular soldier in the middle of this whole goddamn war.
Pointing a needle in a stack of needles.
That's a pretty good point. These Rangers aren't given any real intel about where to find Ryan. The brass just sort of points to Neuville and says, go there and see what you find. I mean, what would have happened if they hadn't bumped into that one guy in Neuville? Would they just be wandering around the countryside for the rest of the war until they found him?
Maybe we should bust up in a couple of different groups, huh? Wander the woods like Hansel and Gretel calling his name. He's bound to hear us sooner or later. Ryan!
That might be a little hard to do, Captain.
Hey, Joe. Doesn't Mendelsohn pal around with Orion from C Company?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, bring him up here, would you?
I love the fact that actually works. But anyway, you get my point. I personally don't believe a mission like this would ever be greenlit, or that the General Chief of Staff of the United States Army would take time to look into it personally. I mean, especially since he was extremely busy overseeing the invasion of Europe. And I feel I can make that assumption based on the true story that Saving Private Ryan was inspired by and how that was handled. Although there was never a Private James Ryan, there was a Sergeant Fritz Nyland. Just like in the movie, Fritz Nyland also had 3 brothers. 2 of them were killed in the Normandy landings, and the 3rd brother, Edward Nyland, was shot down over Burma nearly a month before. And just like Private Ryan, Sergeant Nyland was also a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne. In the early morning hours of D-Day, Fritz and the rest of his unit were on board a plane over Normandy when they started getting hit by German anti-aircraft fire. In the chaos, they had to jump out early and miss their drop zone. On the ground, Fritz and a few other paratroopers he was with tried to find a way to the coast whilst avoiding German patrols. After a few days of fighting, Fritz finally found his unit, only to be horrified with the discovery that his 2 brothers had died and that he was to be sent home immediately. Now in the movie, when Private Ryan is told this, he refuses to leave.
It doesn't make any sense, sir. Why? Why do I deserve to go? Why not any of these guys? They all fought just as hard as me.
Is that what they're supposed to tell your mother? When they send her another folded American flag?
Tell her that when you found me, I was here, and I was with the only brothers that I have left. And there's no way I was gonna desert them.
This is actually quite accurate to how Fritz Nyland responded. He made it quite clear that he had no wish to be given special treatment and wanted to continue fighting, to be with his brothers in arms. Unlike Matt Damon though, Fritz had no chance in convincing the army otherwise, because you can't just pick and choose the orders you're given. He was told that he had to go home and that was that. After months of uncertainty, the Nyland family was once again reunited with Fritz. But amazingly, that was not the end of the story. It turns out that the eldest son, Edward Nyland, had survived the crash in Burma and had been a prisoner of the Japanese for some time. Towards the end of the war, the Japanese deserted the camp, and Edward took the opportunity to escape and was picked up by Allied forces who sent him back to America. And the Nyland family had now 2 surviving sons returned to them when they thought that they had originally lost 3. As a movie, Saving Private Ryan is not without its historical inaccuracies. In fact, it's guilty of having many, but to avoid going into too much detail, I decided to focus on the ones I found to be the most interesting and the most relevant. I really do love this film and I consider it to be one of the greatest World War II movies ever made. And the reason for this is that it makes up for its inaccuracies with its authenticity. Steven Spielberg's objective was to provide us with a narrative of war itself, rather than a detailed account on any one event or persons. To give us an idea of what horrors our grandfather's generation faced. To remind us of the personal sacrifices they made to secure our freedom. Our way of life that we enjoy today is all made possible because of what these brave men did. And this could just be my personal interpretation, but one of the last scenes in the film states this in a very subtle way. What Captain Miller says to Private Ryan could just as easily have been meant for us.
Earn this. Earn it.
Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. Now, just to let you guys know, this will be my last review for the summer of 2016. I'm going to be taking a much-needed holiday for a few months, just Hello and welcome, History Buffs. My name is Nick Hodges and we're back again with another World War II epic. This time we're following in the footsteps of Easy Company. Based on the book Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose, this is the true story of a company of American paratroopers during the Second World War. This miniseries follows their entire story, from their training in America to the battles they fought in France, Holland, Belgium, and to the war's outcome in Germany. Germany. Made in the same style of Saving Private Ryan, it would set the benchmark and show the potential for high-quality television, one that, thankfully, we enjoy to this very day, with the budget of a Hollywood blockbuster and the use of well-developed characters that only a TV series is truly capable of exploring, and you are left with one of the greatest miniseries that has ever been made. This is Band of Brothers. When you think of paratroopers today, your mind generally affiliates them with the Second World War, but the concept actually has its origins towards the end of the First. Many nations played around with the idea of it as a way to overcome the deadlock of trench warfare. In 1917, Winston Churchill proposed to drop entire regiments behind enemy lines, and the concept was equally shared amongst the Americans. In the final weeks of World War I, Brigadier General Billy Mitchell actually planned to execute it. As head of the US Army Air Service, he had the firm belief that air power would play the dominating role in the wars to come. A lieutenant colonel in his staff called Lewis H. Brereton proposed an idea to drop soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division into the German-occupied city of Metz. They would fly over the front lines on Handley Page bombers, slide off the wings, deploy their chutes, and once they landed safely, they would then attack the Germans from the rear. If things played out differently, this would have been the first airborne assault in history. The operation was planned for February 1919, but was shelved quickly due to the armistice and the end of the war. And so the first large-scale military airborne drop would not be achieved by the Americans. The honor would instead go over to the Soviet Union. By 1930, they had invested heavily into this concept and had successfully carried out many airborne operations, obviously during peacetime. The world took notice, and within just a few years, many nations created their own airborne troops, such as Japan, Italy, and of course, Germany. Hitler was particularly interested by what the Soviets had achieved and was keen to adapt airborne forces into the German war machine, looking for anything that would give him an edge. Now today, airborne drops are a tried and proven tactic, but back then, it was really pioneering stuff, and the world got its first taste of it when in April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. In the opening hours of the attack, elite German paratroopers called the Fallschirmjäger captured strategic airfields and bridges. Although their landings were unopposed in Denmark, they did come under fire in Norway, but were highly successful. For the first time in history, concept and theory of airborne troops became a combat-proven reality and demonstrated their tactical necessity on the battlefield. But the Fallschirmjäger were truly tested with the invasion of the British-held island of Crete. They would represent the bulk of German forces that would be deployed, and by the 20th of May 1941, it was the largest airborne assault ever carried out. Just like in previous operations, their objective would be to take a vital airfield. In the first wave of the attack, the Fallschirmjäger were outnumbered 9-1 and were faced by a well-defended enemy. Unlike their early successes in 1940, they didn't have the element of surprise, and the British and their allies would be waiting for them. But despite sustaining heavy losses during the drop and their assault on the airfield, they achieved their objective. The German Air Force was now able to bring in supplies and reinforce the Fallschirmjäger with a mountain division. The next day, a convoy of German and Italian warships attempted to land on the island with further reinforcements. But in the attempt, they were crushed by the Royal Navy and Air Force. This left the 20,000 or so German paratroopers and mountain division with the task of taking on 40,000 British, Australian, New Zealand and Greek forces. Against overwhelming odds, the Fallschirmjäger emerged victorious and drove the Allies into the sea, all thanks to their elite training as paratroopers. This victory proved to the world not just the importance of airborne forces, but what they could be capable of. But surprisingly, Hitler didn't see it that way. The heavy casualties the Fallschirmjäger had suffered was too high of a cost. The early successes in 1940 were contributed by the advantage of surprise, an advantage that can never again be exploited to its full potential.
My name is
and so the Battle of Crete would be the last time the Germans ever carried out major airborne operations. The role of their paratroopers would instead be used as basic infantry. But despite the reservations from German command, America was extremely impressed by the superb performance of their paratroopers in Crete and earlier operations. Now, right around this time, America was just beginning to assemble its own airborne forces and was eager to rise and overtake Germany's high standards. One of these activated divisions would be the 101st Airborne. It would only accept volunteers and put its recruits through a tough and rigorous training program. A program designed to weed out unfit recruits and build up soldiers both mentally and physically to carry out dangerous objectives, ones that would take place deep behind enemy lines with little support and to be completely surrounded. The recruits who passed training would be of a different breed to the average soldier and were treated as such. Band of Brothers even mentioned one of the perks of being a paratrooper was the extra pay.
And then, I don't know what it was, brought it up, but the guy giving the speech was saying, but you get paid $50 a month more. So that made it $100.
Now, what Band of Brothers doesn't mention is why they would be paid $50 a month more. And the reason is actually pretty grim.
Of course, I didn't realize at that time, and I did realize later, that $100 a month jump pay was blood money. I'll find that out later.
This blood money was offered because the army knew what their paratroopers were in for. In fact, they were expecting it. Because the thing is that, unfortunately, like with all paratroopers, their successful performances in the field walk hand in hand with their own mortality. The high loss of life that was considered too high by the Germans was an acceptable cost to the Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that they were intentionally sending these brave men to their deaths. They prepared them as best they could, but the strategic importance of paratroopers could not be ignored. The 101st knew they would play a vital role in the battles to come, and they were all prepared to make that sacrifice. Major General William C. Lee, commander of the 101st and considered the father of the US Airborne, made an important speech to his men on the 19th of August, 1942. The 101st Airborne Division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. Due to the nature of our armament and the tactics in which we shall perfect ourselves, we shall be called upon to carry out operations of far-reaching military importance, and we shall habitually go into action when the need is immediate and extreme. Let me call your attention to the fact that our badge is the Great American Eagle. This is a fitting emblem for a division that will crush its enemies by falling upon them like a thunderbolt from the skies. The history we shall make, the record of high achievement we hope to write in the annals of the American Army and the American people, depends wholly and completely on the men of this division. Each individual, each officer, and each enlisted man must therefore regard himself as a necessary part of a complex and powerful instrument for the overcoming of the enemies of this nation. Each in his own job must realize that he is not only a means, but an indispensable means for obtaining the goal of victory. It is therefore not too much to say that the future itself, in whose molding we expect to have our share, is in the hands of the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division. So now we're on to the part of the review where I discuss the most interesting inaccuracies I discovered during my research of Band of Brothers. Having said that, I am not gonna go over every single little one. I know that a good chunk of you out there are hardcore World War II buffs and might see every inaccuracy the show has as a major infraction. I, on the other hand, need to make the decision about which to prioritize for this video, and also judge them fairly. Tom Hanks, the executive producer behind Band of Brothers, is quoted as saying, "We've made history fit onto our screens. We had to condense down a vast number of characters, fold other people's experiences into 10 or 15 people, have people saying and doing things others said or did. We had people take off their helmets to identify them when they never would have done so in combat. But I still think it is 3 or 4 times more accurate than most films like this." And yeah, I completely agree with him. I'm not too stubborn to admit that compromises need to be made for the purposes of entertainment. I don't have a problem with it as long as they remain respectful to history. And I'm happy to say that for the most part, they did a remarkable job in getting it right. But as with every film or TV series adapted from historical events, there are inaccuracies, and in the case of Band of Brothers, there's going to be some that will really surprise you. So I'm going to begin with the smallest ones, but as I keep progressing, they're going to become, well, you'll see what I mean. So let's begin with that scene from episode 3, when Private Blythe stumbles upon the corpse of a Fallschirmjäger. After realizing that the German paratrooper is dead, Blythe spots a flower on his uniform called an Edelweiss. Then Lewis Nixon explains its symbolic importance.
That's Edelweiss. That only grows in the Alps above the tree line, which means he climbed up there to get it. Supposed to be the mark of a true soldier.
Okay, so what Nixon said there is mostly true. The Edelweiss does only grow in the Alps and the Carpathian Mountains, and it is supposed to represent the mark of a true soldier. but not a paratrooper. Since the First World War, the Edelweiss was used as a symbol by elite German and Austrian mountain troops called Gebirgsjägers, which actually makes a lot more sense since they're the ones training and fighting in the mountains where they grow. But instead of wearing the actual flower itself, it was worn as a badge on their uniform, and the idea of it representing the mark of a true soldier may have its origins in the 1861 novel Edelweiss by Berthold Orbach. In one passage, he describes the difficulties of getting an Edelweiss as, "The possession of one is a proof of unusual daring." The white flower also represented the purity of the Alps and its inhabitants, and it was a statement of German and Austrian patriotism, as seen here in The Sound of Music.
Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever.
Okay, so the reason why I think this is an inaccuracy is because I don't believe any Fallschirmjäger would be cheeky enough to wear an Edelweiss, not without getting his head kicked in by a Gebirgsjäger. It's very similar to the same meaningful importance American paratroopers bestowed on their jump boots.
Another thing they received special permission to do is to wear these very shiny jump boots, they were called, parachute boots. And no other units in the Army could wear that. It was just a very special thing, and the troops loved it. They really did. And many a nose was broken at Fort Benning by paratroopers who caught some non-paratrooper wearing jump boots.
So next we have the scene where Lieutenant Spears shoots the German POWs. Now before you get your knickers in a twist, I'm not saying that this scene is 100% accurate or inaccurate. What is presented on screen is meant to represent the real rumours and speculations made by Easy Company. Having said that, Don Malarkey did not witness Spears gun down this group of German prisoners. This is based off of what he said in his book Easy Company Soldier. But that doesn't mean that Spears didn't shoot POWs. There's at least one eyewitness report confirming that he did, and it may have contributed to the more exaggerated rumours. Like the one shown in Band of Brothers, there's a great interview with Art de Maurizio, a dog company trooper who was with Lieutenant Spears on D-Day and took part in the shooting.
When we landed on the ground, that was on D-Day, we had captured 3 Germans, and I was with a lieutenant, the platoon leader, and jump master he was, and another sergeant, and there was nothing we could do with the Germans, and the lieutenant called us together in a bunch, and he said, "Jumbo," he says, "you take that one," and we're all laying in a ditch, and I'll take this one, and Sarge, you take that one. And we paired off, and we shot the 3 of them.
Now sadly, the reason why they shot those Germans is because they didn't have the time to take prisoners. They were right in the middle of D-Day, they were trying to regroup with the rest of their company, and they had to reach their objective, all the while being deep behind enemy lines and completely surrounded. They didn't have the resources to feed them, shelter them, or the manpower to guard them. If they let them go, then the prisoners would tell other Germans where they were, and they were also ordered not to take prisoners on D-Day. General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 101st Airborne, told his paratroopers that if they took prisoners, they would handicap their ability to perform their mission. Now, I'm personally not condoning any of this. This is just, unfortunately, one of the tragedies of warfare, but I think it's important to understand the given context of that situation. As to the other rumours surrounding Spears shooting POWs on different occasions, I must say that I don't fully know if they're true or not. This is just the only one that seems credible to me. Moving on to this next inaccuracy, which, I'm not gonna lie, this is really stupid. Either this is shoddy writing or a huge mistake. If it is, I cannot believe that this wasn't corrected when it aired on television or even when it came out on DVD. It's at the beginning of episode 9 when the title clearly says April 11th, 1945. It opens up with the string quartet playing Beethoven and we see civilians clearing the streets of rubble. The camera then finally rests on members of Easy Company overlooking the Germans. Then it goes into a flashback and it remains that way for the rest of the episode until the very end when we return to this scene.
Hitler's dead.
Holy shit.
Shot himself in Berlin.
No dude, he hasn't. This is April 11th and Hitler didn't shoot himself until April 30th. So, unless they remain frozen in that spot for over 2 weeks, then what he just said is absolute malarkey.
Malarkey. Malarkey's slang for bullshit, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Hitler by this point was alive and kicking. Hell, he was probably still in his bunker bitching about Mass Effect Andromeda. So the next one I have is a little controversial, and it has to do with the portrayal of Lieutenant Dyke. Now, you'll remember him as the officer who panicked during the attack on Foy and ordered his men to stop advancing, whilst they were exposed and vulnerable out in the open. Carwood Lipton, the company's first sergeant, stated that Dyke had fallen apart. This wasn't seen as a major surprise by anyone in Easy Company, since Lieutenant Dyke wasn't particularly liked, especially by Winters, who viewed Dyke as an incompetent officer who often disappeared without explanation, who didn't look after his men, and preferred to hide in foxholes rather than fight, earning him the unflattering nickname Foxhole Norman. These are the accounts that led to what you see on the screen. However, there might be a little bit more to the story than that. According to Clancy Lyle, who was at Foy, he saw Lieutenant Dyke get shot in his right shoulder and was panicking due to the wound and not the situation. Shortly afterwards, he was brought to the rear by a medic and relieved of command by Spears. The thing is, the simple explanation of Dyke being a coward doesn't really hold up once you take a closer look. For example, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars for acts of valor. Once in Holland, when on the 23rd of September 1944, he organised and led scattered groups of parachutists in the successful defence for the important road junction on the vital Eindhoven-Arnhem supply route against superior and repeated attacks, while being completely surrounded. Dyke was also awarded a 2nd Bronze Star at Bastogne, when on the 3rd of January 1945, he personally removed from an exposed position in full enemy view 3 wounded members of his company whilst under intense small arms fire. Based on my research, I believe that Dyke was a flawed man, certainly deserving of some of the criticism shared by Easy Company, but not to the extent where he has been unfairly immortalised as a coward due to what happens at Foy. It probably haunted him to the end of his days, and most of us will never know how we would react in that given situation. So moving on from that, we have the most famous inaccuracy in all of Band of Brothers. No, seriously, it's very impressive. In fact, it's a bit of a showstopper. It's going to make you go, oh? When you hear about it. It all has to do with the character of Albert Blythe. He serves as the central protagonist in episode 3, and the bulk of it is dedicated just for him, so there's no question about the importance of getting him right. Now, just like many of the other characters in the show, he is based on a real soldier, and many of the things he goes through in Band of Brothers actually happened. Except for one tiny detail. You see at the very end of the episode, Blythe gets shot in the neck and he ends up in a military hospital, and then the credits appear, stating that Albert Blythe never recovered from the wounds he received in Normandy. He died in 1948. Except he didn't. He recovered from his wounds and died in 1967.
What? Your Grace! Your Eminence!
Sorry, that's exactly how I reacted when I found out. I mean, how in the hell did they miss that? This is not a minor character. The whole episode is dedicated to him. Okay, so basically the real story is that when Blythe was shot by that sniper outside that farmhouse, he was instead shot either in his collarbone or his right shoulder, but not his neck. Blythe was shipped back home to have his wounds treated and never returned to Europe. The rest of Easy Company never found out what happened and for some reason assumes that he died in 1948. When Stephen Ambrose, the author of Band of Brothers, was told this, he didn't question it. He wrote it down in his book and that story carried over for the TV series. But imagine if Blythe didn't die in 1967. Wouldn't it be hilarious if he had lived to see Band of Brothers air on television and he's watching an entire episode dedicated to him? He's feeling pretty chuffed about it, he's enjoying it, and then at the very end it says that he died. Okay. So now we're on to the final inaccuracy in this review, and come to think about it, it's really not that bad. I just personally feel that the true story is more interesting than what is presented on screen. It's a very quick moment when Major Winters formally accepts the surrender of a German colonel. As with tradition, the German offers his pistol as a symbolic gesture of his surrender, but Major Winters declines and allows him to keep it. So first of all, in real life, this colonel was actually a major. I have no idea why they felt the need to change his rank to colonel. I don't think it adds anything to the scene other than it's more impressive that he's higher in rank to Winters. But then again, why stop there? Why not make him a general or a field marshal while you're at it? It's just pointless if you ask me. Secondly, Major Winters accepted the pistol from the Major and kept it. all the way up until he died, and the story behind the pistol and what it meant to Winters is very moving, and I felt that they missed a great opportunity to include it.
I was assigned this major, and when he walked in, he presented me this pistol and offered his personal surrender, which naturally I accepted.
Ce nu mai sunt până la pet?
Gratefully.
La ce?
So that would be the end of the war for his men.
Ia zi.
And this is basically
spui
the
la
end of
ce?
the war
La
for
pet.
my men.
La pet.
And the
Ce este?
significance is that it wasn't until later when he had given me this pistol and I had a chance to look at it carefully that I realized this pistol had never been fired.
Nu mai poți să dai rename. What the fuck?
There was no blood on it. That's the way all wars should end, with an agreement with no blood on it. And I assure you, this pistol has never, never been fired since I've had it, and it will not be fired.
So that concludes everything I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please don't take this video to mean that I didn't enjoy Band of Brothers. I think that this is one of the greatest Second World War adaptations ever made. The benefits of it being made as a mini-series allows us to follow this company of soldiers all the way from training right up until VE Day. The time constraints of a feature film is no longer an issue, allowing the audience to spend more time with each of these well-crafted characters. So when some of these characters do lose their lives, their losses have a much greater impact, and we can gain a small glimpse of what it must have been like for these brave men and the sacrifices they had to make day by day, week by week, and month by month. The successes of Band of Brothers far outweigh any of the inaccuracies I've mentioned, and I'm sure that the vast majority of you agree with me. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at... This episode sponsored by Grey Horses Plus. Hello and welcome, History Buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and join me on a trip to the Windy City, the birthplace of the Untouchables. It is 1930 in Prohibition Chicago, and its once peaceful streets have turned into an active war zone that is fought over by brutal gangs, each vying for power in the illegal bootlegging trade. The most dominant is the South Side Gang, led by the infamous mobster Al Capone. His violent rise to power has made him think he's above the law, and for good reason. With all the cops, judges, and politicians in his pocket, no one has dared cross him yet. That was until a Prohibition agent called Elliot Ness and his elite team single-handedly took him down. At least that's what happens in the movie. History, on the other hand, paints a completely different picture, one that I will share over the course of this review, and piece by piece we will uncover the true story behind the Untouchables. Now, before I get into the Untouchables, I thought it'd be a good idea to tell a bit of the history behind Prohibition and how it was able to lead to the rise of organized crime in Chicago. Between 1920 and 1933, a constitutional ban was set in place to abolish the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol within the United States. A president during this time called Herbert Hoover once described Prohibition as the great social and economic experiment, but unbeknownst to him, it was one that America was destined to fail. By the dawn of the 20th century, a grassroots social movement was making waves in the political landscape. Its deeply tied religious beliefs viewed alcohol as a blight on America's morality and condemned its consumption as the sole reason behind all its woes. It was known as the temperance movement, and from the very beginning, it was women who had helped champion the cause. Many of them had seen firsthand the destructive role alcohol had played within their families and marriages. whether it had been as victims of domestic abuse or to witness their alcoholic fathers and husbands spend away their life savings. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was amongst the first to successfully push through the idea of temperance into the public eye, that began dividing Americans with its politics into two camps: the wets and the dries, with the wets supporting the consumption and sale of alcohol, whilst the dries didn't. A prominent figurehead of the dries was a man named Wayne Wheeler, who was the leader of a temperance society called the Anti-Saloon League, which was by far the most effective. Unlike the WCTU, it was an organization made up of both men and women, and as far as its policies were concerned, the total ban of alcohol was the only thing they cared about. The Anti-Saloon League was able to rise to power by directing its devout followers to vote for politicians who supported them, and vote against the ones who didn't. The League wasn't interested whether they were Democrats or Republicans. As long as they played to their fiddle, they were guaranteed votes, even if that meant those politicians were privately drinkers themselves. A huge turning point for the dries came in April 1917, when America entered the First World War. The Anti-Saloon League, the WCTU, and other temperance societies banded together to exploit an anti-German hysteria that was gripping the nation. They did this by pumping out propaganda specifically targeting German-American beer makers. Suddenly, drinking beer brands like Schlitz, Miller, Blatz, or Busch was made to seem like an act of treason. With public opinion on their side, the Anti-Saloon League pushed Washington to institute a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for the war effort. This was a huge win for the dry activists, but they went even further by proposing a prohibition amendment to Congress. They didn't just want a law passed to ban alcohol, as laws could be repealed or changed. The dries wanted it to be immortalized into the American Constitution, as no amendment had ever been repealed before then. And so on August 1st, 1917, the United States Senate voted 65-20 in favor of the 18th Amendment. The House of Representatives followed shortly afterwards, and largely voted in favor on December 18th, 1917. In an effort to stave off prohibition, the wet supporters in Congress had previously made a deal with the dries, granting them only 6 years to receive the support for 3/4 of the United States for final approval. They had no idea it would only take 11 months. It was ratified into law on January 16th, 1919, and went into effect just a year later. And so when the stroke of midnight began to approach on January 16th, 1920, Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and in this very special episode, to celebrate reaching over 250,000 subscribers, we'll be leaving the confines of our planet and venturing far out into space on board Apollo 13. It's April 1970. Less than a year has passed since Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon on Apollo 11. Since then, Apollo 12 made an equally successful landing, and NASA has now launched Apollo 13, also intended to land on the moon. But 56 hours later, and over 200,000 miles from Earth, an unforeseen accident occurs that jeopardizes the lives of the entire crew. This film is based on the true story of what those astronauts went through, and the collaborative effort of Mission Control to bring them back home alive. And over the course of this review, I'll be discussing in great length the history of the space race, I'll be covering Apollo 13's mission, and finally discuss how faithful was the film to what actually happened. This is Apollo 13. Isn't it super awesome that we now live in a time where we can look back on our own history and know that we have traveled into space? Not only that, but we have walked on the surface of the moon, the very celestial body that every single human being that has ever lived has gazed upon. It truly does capture the imagination. And not that long ago, such an idea only existed in the realm of science fiction. In 1865, Jules Verne published the book From the Earth to the Moon, and got remarkably close to how it actually happened just over a century later with the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. For example, he decided that out of all the nations on Earth, that America would be the one to do it. And through his calculations, he predicted that the launch site would be in southern Florida. He predicted that it would be in the month of December, that it would take 3 days to travel to the moon, and that the capsule would return to Earth by being recovered at sea. The only big thing he got wrong was that in real life, a rocket was used, whilst the Americans in his book used a giant cannon. But even so, it's pretty amazing on how much he was able to get right. So the question stands, how did the romantic idea of traveling to the moon make the transition from science fiction to science fact? Well, the roots of mankind's greatest journey can be found at the end of World War II. It's September 1944, and Hitler is desperate to find a solution in winning the war. That was when he unleashed a new secret weapon, the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile. Packed with explosives, the V-2s were launched against Allied cities such as Paris, Antwerp, and London. Although a terrifying weapon, it's important to note that this was the first man-made object to cross the boundary of space before falling back to Earth and hitting its target. And this was certainly not lost on the German rocket scientist who developed it. His name was Wernher von Braun. His life's work had always been in the pursuit of space travel, and with his rocket technology, he was convinced that it was the key to reaching the heavens. In fact, you could say he was pretty much obsessed with it, and all other potential moral ambiguities were considered secondary. For example, later in life when he was questioned about his V-2 rockets, he's quoted as saying, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." So when he joined the Nazi Party in 1937, he saw it as a career move, one that would get him all the funding he would ever need to realize his dream. In the final days of the war, the Allies and the Soviets were pushing further and further into Germany. Secretly, both sides were searching for von Braun, as they could see the terrible potential his weapons had, particularly the Americans, as they were already developing their own super weapon at the time. If von Braun's rocket technology could be combined with the atomic bomb, it would be the most destructive weapon in history. Neither the Americans nor the Soviets knew it yet, but they had just taken the first steps in what eventually became the space race. Now, von Braun was perfectly aware that the Third Reich's days were numbered, and if he wished to continue pursuing his dream of space travel, it would have to be elsewhere, especially since he knew that the Nazi officers who were protecting him and his team were under orders to shoot him if it looked like he was going to fall in enemy hands. So obviously, he had to escape and weighed his options on who to surrender to. The Soviets were the less desirable choice, since it was well known how they treated their prisoners. Only real option was to surrender to the Americans, and after his escape, that's exactly what he did. In exchange for his full cooperation and knowledge of the V-2 rocket program, von Braun would be given full immunity and was whisked away to the United States. With von Braun out of their reach, the Soviets now had to play catch-up by scavenging abandoned V-2 rocket factories and finding other German rocket engineers who had been left behind in East Germany. They would also recruit one man to take von Braun's position as chief designer in their rocket program, and that man was Sergei Korolev. Now, he had been falsely imprisoned during the Great Purge under acts of sabotage in the Soviets' Rocket Research Institute and was sentenced to 10 years in one of Stalin's gulags. In 1945, he was released after serving 6 years of his 10-year sentence by recommendation from one of the very men who had denounced him in the first place, his old colleague, Valentin Glushko. Now, I'm sure Glushko felt incredibly awkward about the whole situation, but he was smart enough to know that Sergei Korolev was the man for the job. Not only was he an innovator, a genius, but for all intents and purposes, he would become von Braun's rival and ultimately his equal, especially since they both shared the same dream of space travel. On August 6, 1945, the world was stunned when America dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This only served to strengthen Soviet resolve because not only did the Americans possess the A-bomb now, but von Braun and his rockets. Just a month before this, however, a Soviet spy called Klaus Fuchs, who had been working on the Manhattan Project, stole classified blueprints of the atom bomb and sent them to Moscow on the 2nd of July, 1945. Once the Soviets witnessed the atomic bomb's true destructive power in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin immediately ordered that their own bombs be built, as well as continue developing their rocket technology. The Soviets were under the natural assumption that the next logical step for America would be to build missiles fitted with their atomic weapons. But surprisingly, that wasn't the case. Von Braun and his team weren't continuing their research. The Americans were quite happy to let their department collect dust, preferring to instead entrust future delivery of the bombs be made by planes, just like they had done in Japan. That was until they got their wake-up call. On the 29th of August 1949, the first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated on a test site in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. This time the West was horrified, especially with how quickly the Soviet Union was able to do it. And just a month later, on the 25th of September 1949, the Soviets had successfully launched an improved version of the V-2 rocket, which they dubbed the R-2. It had twice the range of the V-2 and was capable of hitting England. 1949 was significant because it marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race between America and the Soviet Union, each side working furiously to develop nuclear weapons capable of destroying each other, and much of the time they spent doing so was very neck and neck. On November 1st, 1952, the Americans tested the world's first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean. On the 12th of August 1953, the Russians developed an H-bomb of their own and tested it in Kazakhstan. Now, some of you may be asking, what does all this have to do with space travel? Well, the development of the rocket technology necessary for space travel could only have been achieved with military funding. So when Sergei Korolev was asked if he could build a new rocket that could transport a thermonuclear warhead to America, he said yes he could, because he knew that same rocket could also reach space and also transport and launch a satellite in Earth's orbit. The funding he got from the Soviet Union was exactly what he needed to make that happen. In America, however, von Braun was having a much harder time selling the idea to the US Army, and was hardly getting any funding at all for his rockets. So what he decides to do instead, and I find this very funny by the way, is to go over the Army's head and instead sell the idea of space flight and traveling to the moon directly to the American people. How does he do this? Well, through Walt Disney, of course.
Here to reveal a plan for a trip around the moon is the Chief of the Guided Missile Development at the United States Army's Redstone Arsenal, Dr. Werner von Braun.
A voyage around the moon must be made in 2 phases. A rocket ship taking off from the Earth's surface will use almost all the fuel it can carry just to attain a speed great enough to balance the pull of gravity. Unpowered, it will then keep circling the Earth in an orbit outside of the atmosphere. This is the first phase. However, if we can refuel the ship in this orbit with fuel brought up by cargo rocket ships, it can set out on the second phase, the trip around the moon and back.
This televised primetime event made Dr. Werner von Braun a household name as 40 million Americans were glued to their screens. Von Braun's plan absolutely worked as things began to get moving in Washington that would later help him get the funding he needed for his rockets.
The President today approved plans by this country of going forward for the launching of a small, unmanned, Earth-circling satellite in the region.